Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and today I'm reviewing The Innocence of Father Brown by G.K. Chesterton, which was published in 1911. This is not a novel, this is a collection of 12 short stories, each of them a case for Catholic priest and amateur detective Father Brown. The crimes are usually either murders or thefts, and while one of the early stories mentions his parish being in Essex, most of the stories are actually set in London. As is often the case in these classic detective stories, the detective himself takes a bit of a backseat. In this one though, I find him too flat as a character because we basically know nothing about him. Like I said, it's mentioned that his parish is in Essex, and yet he seems to spend an awful lot of time running into murderers and jewel thieves in London. We don't know anything about his background, we don't know anything about his daily life, we don't even know that much about his position as a faith leader. His personality falls into the deceptively innocent looking type, which of course he plays up in order to get results. He's often underestimated not just by the villains of the stories, but also by those who are in need of his services as a detective. More often than not, he isn't exactly called to solve a case, but just kind of stumbles across it in a series of very convenient coincidences. I'm going to say right away, I didn't care for this collection of stories. There were 12 stories in this, and I stopped reading after 10. Just couldn't bring myself to read the other two. And the main reason for that is that I found they had a somewhat unfinished quality about them. In particular, a lot of them have very abrupt endings. After the first story ended, I actually thought there was still more, and then suddenly we were at story 2 and I didn't know where the rest of the story went. Like, there should be at least another page or two after the villain is unmasked, but there is nothing. There's no aftermath, there's no wrap-up. These stories, a lot of them read like first drafts. Like, they should still be expanded and edited to make a complete reading experience. The same is true for the continuity between stories, though I have to say that didn't bother me as much because that's the case with a lot of, for example, classic Sherlock Holmes adventures where the continuity is a bit dodgy. You know, if you really think hard about it, there are some plot holes or some things that just don't make sense between stories. But one example from The Innocence of Father Brown is the recurring character, a Frenchman called Flambeau. This is someone who we're introduced to in the very first story as a notorious jewelry thief. And he shows up again in a later story as the main villain. But when Father Brown solves this case, he sort of monologues at him that he should abandon his sinful ways and live a righteous life. Flambeau basically doesn't respond. And then, like, one story later, all of a sudden, he has not just given up his life of crime, but he has become Father Brown's closest friend and a professional detective. What? This change of heart is not addressed at all. The author had the perfect opportunity here to do some character development, to have an interesting character, turn from literally being a criminal to someone who fights crime, and he just didn't care to do any of that. And so the character of Flambeau just seems a bit weak. It doesn't help that Flambeau, who is for most of this book a professional detective, seems entirely incapable at his job after we are told that he's an excellent jewel thief. So he just sort of trots around with Father Brown and listens to his explanation. He is the Dr. Watson type to Father Brown's Sherlock, but less competent than Dr. Watson, much less competent. And that's the case with many of the characters in the book, including Father Brown himself. They just don't read like fully formed people. They don't read like characters. They don't even read like caricatures. I don't mind in crime fiction when there's archetypes and caricatures, shorthands. You know, these are short stories. We don't need a fully fledged backstory for every single person in every single story. But a lot of these characters feel very wishy-washy, not solidly drawn, not well thought about. And unfortunately, the two characters that show up again and again, Father Brown and Flambeau, also fall under that category. If we just look at the mysteries, as puzzles, they're a bit unsatisfying as well. And they tend to fall into two camps. There are some where the whodunit is very easy to guess, where even if you don't quite know the minutiae of how a crime was committed, you can at least be fairly certain who did it. And that's because the characters, the suspects, they're not fleshed out enough for the story to allow for a convincing red herring. So the guy you think did it probably did it. The other camp is one where the solution is so absurd that they don't make any sense at all. And they are even less fun to read about. Sometimes you get a sort of hybrid type story where you know immediately who did it, but when you hear how they did it, it is entirely absurd and not realistic. And again, this sounds like this would apply to a lot of other classic detective stories, but bearing in mind Father Brown is a contemporary of Sherlock Holmes. This book was published in 1911, so around the same time that many Sherlock Holmes stories and novels were coming out. It doesn't have the same finesse in the mysteries. There are many Sherlock Holmes stories where you think that doesn't make any sense at all, and yet the stories kind of convince you that, yeah, no, this is definitely a thing that could have happened. The Father Brown stories do not have this ambition. They don't try and convince you that this is at all possible or likely or makes sense as a crime. The detective himself, Father Brown, also tends to jump to wild conclusions that just happen to be correct because he's a fictional detective who's never wrong. He seems to be able to read minds because the way he correctly predicts the most outlandish motives just doesn't make sense. A lot of his crime solving seems to rely on this nearly supernatural ability to understand people, and it goes so far that he basically never actually questions suspects or inspects crime scenes or finds clues. He just shows up halfway through a story and immediately knows what's going on. Sometimes he doesn't, sometimes he just sits there on the edge of the story until he has an epiphany, and that's it. As you can tell, I was disappointed so far because I am a fan of the Sherlock Holmes stories and I was hoping for something equally as compelling and readable, which this unfortunately was not. Another grating thing was that Father Brown just happens to be around when and where a murder takes place. I know this is a fairly common trope, but I feel like most authors of detective fiction, even at the time, try to avoid it or at least not utilize it all the time. Not Chesterton. Poor Father Brown probably is quite traumatized by the sheer amount of times he goes to visit a random friend and have people drop dead left, right and centre around him, which is actually a bit suspect if you ask me. In particular, if you consider his persistent habit to let murderers get away with it after he gives them a sermon. By the third or fourth time that happened, I was raging, where someone had quite literally killed another person and Father Brown takes their confession, gives them a sermon and a slap on the wrist and then lets them go away and get on with their life. What's so frustrating about this is that there is so much potential here. I really did like the little we saw of Father Brown as a character. He is so very Catholic in his outlook. He likes to moralize every now and again, but he also has a flair for the dramatic. He indulges in a bit of mysticism on the side. He takes a very clerical approach to the villains he unmasks. He's also really funny. Some of the prose was very entertaining to read, and some of the dialogue given to him made me want to like him as a character. The building blocks are there for a really fun and compelling series of mysteries, but the author just didn't manage to get the most out of his concept and his premise. So unfortunately, these stories weren't quite readable enough for me not to DNF the book. As I said, I made it through 10 of the 12 stories. I might finish them at some point just because I don't like leaving books unfinished, but I doubt I'll read any more of the Father Brown stories in the future, unless you in the comments tell me that the books improve in quality the further we go into the series. If so, then do give me your recommendations, and I might at some point, when I'm really craving a detective story, give him another chance. So would I recommend this book? That's always how I finish my book reviews. And the answer is I'd recommend them if you are really into early detective mysteries. Then you might get something out of them, but other than that, there are much better detective books from the early 20th century that you would enjoy more. This, by the way, is the second of my 12 Decades of Christmas video series, in which I review one book from each decade between 1900s and the 2010s in the run-up to Christmas. This book was published in the 1910s, so the book review coming out tomorrow is going to be from the 1920s and so on. These aren't necessarily my favorite books of the decade, as you can tell by this rather negative review. They're more so books that I haven't done a dedicated review video for, and you can find the entire playlist linked in the description box. Thank you for watching. Bye!